As Reverend Kowalski lights our chalice this morning, I invite you to speak aloud our affirmation. If you are on Zoom, please keep muted as you speak. The words are printed in the chat line. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To serve human need. For these high purposes, do we unite in worship.
Democracy is in decline. Freedom House reports that fewer people now are living under popular governments than at any time since the fall of the Soviet Union. Here at home, 19 states have passed 34 laws making it harder to vote. Almost half of all Americans tell pollsters that they think our democracy is in crisis, and they say that for completely different reasons. Americans have seldom been this divided. Faith in public institutions is at a low ebb. Here are some of the signs and symptoms of a republic in decline. The Supreme Court has lost credibility. Getting a seat on the court is now a matter of gamesmanship, not statesmanship. Public schools that are intended to create educated citizens have become boxing rings for brawling over unisex bathrooms and book bans. Organized religion is fading, while QAnon and these cult-like conspiracies are filling the vacuum that were once occupied by mainstream churches and synagogues. Hate crimes rising. Just yesterday, 10 people murdered in Buffalo in a racially motivated massacre. By many measures, the United States is shredding at the seams. Passengers are punching out flight attendants on airplanes. Why is that? Homicides are surging. Armed militias are plotting to kidnap and lynch members of Congress, which some say is legitimate political discourse. Which is scarier, the trigger-happy vigilantes or the politicians who incite and coddle them? In Ukraine these past few weeks, we witnessed what happens when a democracy is assaulted by an external foe. In the U.S., the enemies are mostly internal, although we do know that Russia has hacked social media to sow division in our nation, stoking discord over issues like immigration, fueling Islamophobia, fanning flames of tribalism. Russian trolls manufactured fake Facebook pages that attacked refugees while celebrating the Confederate flag. They generated phony Black Lives Matter pages that likened police to ISIS terrorists. Their strategy, ugly, was just to stir things up. But the Russians aren't all to blame, and neither are Donald Trump nor the pandemic, which just served to exacerbate existing tensions. You just have to look at the comments section of most newspapers to understand that vitriol and rancor are endemic in our culture. And I think it's important that we face the reality and the magnitude of this threat. As James Baldwin wrote, not everything that's faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until we face it. So we have to acknowledge the depth and the extent of the dangers, but we shouldn't exaggerate them either, because despite all of these threats, there are still some signs of health in the body politic. Here's something I bet you didn't know. Over the past decade, prison populations in the United States have plummeted by 300,000 inmates. That's roughly equal to the size of a mid-sized city like St. Louis. That's a lot of liberation. Barack and Michelle Obama still consistently top the lists of the world's most admired men and women. Last year, Trump was on the list, but he was below the captain of India's national cricket team. Though hate crimes are rising, so are the numbers of Americans who identify themselves as biracial or multiracial. 94% of Americans say that interracial marriage is no big thing. You know, that's up from 4% when I was in grade school. So we may yet smooch our way to a great big human family hug. Despite a pandemic, Americans showed up at the polls or sent in ballots by mail in record numbers in 2020. And although organized religion is slipping in influence, more and more churches are embracing women's ordination. They're celebrating gay unions, even as the landscape becomes more diverse, so that the number of mosques and synagogues and Hindu and Buddhist temples now rivals the number of Catholic parishes across the country. Maybe America is not falling apart at the seams after all. You know, the divorce rate is at an almost 50-year low. People are shopping less. You know, they're spending more time and money on experiences. They're going to yoga retreats and master classes, things that just might make them a little more well-rounded human beings. Maybe even the rise of the nuns, the people with no religious affiliation. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. You know, a little irreverence never hurt anyone. Maybe more important than surveys or polling data is a study from Stanford that found that when 1,000 citizens from across the political spectrum were assembled to address the reality and threat of climate change, minds changed. These were individuals from a whole spectrum of socioeconomic backgrounds: black, white, male, female, conservative, liberals. Over the course of 6 days, they were gathered together to dialogue, to read briefing papers on both sides, to ask questions from a panel of nonpartisan experts. And the experiment was called America in One Room. Participation was voluntary, discussions were respectful, and attitudes shifted. Climate skeptics became climate believers. 3/4 of all the people there left convinced that it was important to reach net zero carbon emissions in the near future. That represents hope. I like this idea of America in one room after my own recent stay in the hospital. Last November, some of you know, I was rushed down to Albuquerque for some emergency surgery, where I spent 5 days sharing a cubicle with a very conservative Roman Catholic who happened to be named Gary. Like me, this was a popular boy's name back in the 50s, and we were very close in age, but very far apart in politics and theology. We were as different as Owen and MZ. During a lull in the conversation, I asked Gary what he thought about our current pope. He said he thought Pope Francis was a communist. I asked him if he thought Jesus was a communist too, which gave him some pause. And we had some interesting chats about Roswell and Area 51, but we were just separated by this flimsy curtain. So we had to find a way to share that space and disagree without being disagreeable. And fortunately, we did find some common ground. We could agree that the hospital pizza was edible. We could agree that our wives were both complete gems. We could agree that getting old was not for the faint-hearted. And we could laugh about racing each other around the nurse's station in our walkers. We even agreed that elections might be more trustworthy if we went back to old-fashioned paper ballots, no online or electronic voting, so we actually had a trail of who won or lost. made me think that maybe our ailing nation could benefit from a collective visit to the hospital. You know, one thing I noticed immediately is that hospitals look very much like America. Of the half dozen physicians who attended me, 3 were women, 2 were from India. Dr. Chen was presumably East Asian. My night nurse was African American. The 2 candy stripers who finally wheeled me out the door were young white guys from Georgia who were doing some kind of young adult ministry for their church. This was in the middle of a surge. Hospitals, all the staff were operating under crisis standards. They'd been coping with COVID for almost 2 years. They had every right to be burned out and bitter and on edge. But on the contrary, I found that they were working as a team, just grace under pressure, taking as good a care of me as if I were the only patient there. I think our democracy would be a lot stronger if we had to share one room occasionally. The way juries do in their chambers. They're forced to talk about important issues and not just find consensus. They actually have to find unanimity, and the marvel is that they do that almost all the time. So I try not to second guess 12 people who've listened to all the evidence that I haven't. When I think about America in one room, I imagine how it used to be or how it was supposed to be. Who do we have who's a vet here, who's been in uniform? Come on. Really?
Joe Sykes in the back.
Okay, Joe. Yeah, thanks, Joe. My image, anyway, is that it's supposed to be unit cohesion, where people from different sides of the tracks, from north and south, they've got to come together. They've got to share the same latrine, sometimes the same foxhole, and have each other's backs. So they form a team. And that may be one of the reasons why the U.S. military remains one of the few institutions that's still widely esteemed today across party lines, probably because of role models like the current Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, a four-star general who grew up in segregated schools in Mobile, Alabama, to become the chair of the Joint Chiefs, who's now committed to rooting out extremism in the ranks. America's in trouble, but we have to navigate that line between complacency and despair. Unless we acknowledge the problems, we can't solve them, but if all we see are issues, then we just throw up our hands. And I think UUs have an important role to play in finding that balance, because ours is a democratic faith, or it is supposed to be. I say supposed to be because we don't always live up to that ideal. Church politics can be just as brutal as our national politics. And yet our congregation should be workshops for self-government, where we can have differences of opinion, where there can be a clash of ideas, and we don't put down or denigrate one another. So as religious liberals, let's be careful not to demonize those with whom we disagree. Let's not adopt the tactics of our adversaries by banning books or public shaming. Don't cancel those with opposing views. In fact, I've always thought that if we really valued diversity, we would welcome more political variety in our congregations. There would be Republicans as well as libertarians and Greens and independents, because we're not a wing of the Democratic Party. In fact, we should be critics of any party line that threatens to become a new orthodoxy. Without being doctrinaire, we have to be principled. We can't roll back the clock on voting rights or on same-sex marriage. We can't let a partisan court rob women of their right to make their own decisions on family matters. We do have to fight back. But the only way to score permanent victories is to forge broader and broader alliances, to meet with people where they are, to allow ourselves to be changed by that encounter, to invite more and more folks into that one big room where we don't have to look alike or think alike to love alike. If we play the long game, we'll realize that the best way to bring our world closer together, to lower the degree of separation and strife, is in the old-fashioned way, through charity, through compassion, through patience and goodwill, by turning strangers into friends and enemies into conversation partners, one by one by one. So be curious. Don't assume you know what's right for others. Get to know your neighbors. Learn a foreign language. Talk to someone under 30. Zoom with your extended family. If your family is anything like my family, there are ex-Marines and vegans and queer activists and Seventh-day Adventists all trying to get through dinner without a food fight. But the most immediate thing we can do to safeguard our freedom is to share this time and this space together, practicing tolerance, speaking temperately, educating ourselves and each other, actively listening to divergent ideas, understanding that democracy springs from the grassroots. It's not from inside the Beltway. It's from people like us, introverts, extroverts, young people, old people, pagans, humanists, a not quite random assortment of heterogeneous, but not all hetero people, all who love this faith and who love this country, trying to be Americans in one room. Amen.